Czy Trump jest rosyjskim agentem, czy też agentem wpływu, bądź jak to mówią, zasobem Kremla? Przypuszczam, że zadawaliście już sobie to pytanie. Dzisiaj odpowie nam na nie amerykański dziennikarz i pisarz Craig Unger, który poświęcił Trumpowi już kilka książek. Wcześniej innym amerykańskim politykom, był szefem magazynu Boston oraz The New York Times Observer. Opowie nam również o relacji Trumpa z agencją FBI i o tym, dlaczego nie ma śledztw na temat jego powiązań z Rosją. Jednocześnie serdecznie Wam dziękuję za wsparcie, jakie mi okazaliście na Patronite i tutaj przy subskrypcjach i proszę o kontynuację oraz o szerowanie, bo to pomaga mi podejmować śmielsze kroki i tak na przykład dzięki Waszej pomocy następną korespondencję będę mogła przysłać z Budapesztu. Serdecznie zapraszam na ten nowy odcinek.
It definitely looks like Trump is paying back something to the Kremlin by offending Zelensky in the Oval Office, or by stopping the aid for Ukraine, or trying to dismantle NATO, or trying to withdraw from the United Nations. So what does it mean? Because if Kremlin made a favor to Trump, then what kind of favors Russia paid to him before?
Well, I think it's where you have to go back more than 40 years to really answer that question. And it really started, to me, in 1980, when Donald Trump was a young, flashy real estate developer. He was still in his 30s. He was just starting out in real estate development. And he was not nearly as successful as most people seemed to think he was for all his wealth. And he had many, many failures over the years. But in 1980, he had his first genuine success, and he was developing the Grand Hyatt Hotel in Midtown Manhattan, right next to Grand Central Station. And he made a fortune over this. At the time, New York City was bankrupt, and it was just starting to come back. So he got terrific tax breaks from the city. And in building this hotel and developing it, like any hotel, it needed lots of TV sets for every hotel room. And where did he get the TV sets? He got them from an electronics store that was essentially a KGB front. It was called Joy Ludd Electronics. It was near the Flatiron Building, which is sort of a landmark here in Manhattan. And he got a terrific deal, cheap television sets, and that was the door opener. The man who sold the TV sets to him was a man named Semyon Kislin. And one of my sources was a former KGB officer named Yuri Shvets. And according to Yuri Shvets, Kislin was a spotter agent for the KGB. That is, he was seeking assets he could recruit for the KGB. And this sort of opened the door to the relationship between Trump and the Russians.
But how come Trump learned about this store?
I don't have all the details of it, but Kislin, who is still alive, did confirm that he made the sale to him. He denied that he had a relationship with the KGB. There are questions about that are open. But Trump began to have a series of other meetings with various other Russians, and they included members of the Russian mafia. In 1984, for example, a man named David Bogadin, and according to FBI files, Bogadin was affiliated with the Russian mafia, and the Russian mafia in turn was very, very close to the KGB back then. This is very different than the mafia in the United States, where we had the FBI was always at war with the Italian mafia, if you've seen The Godfather or other movies. But the KGB and the Russian mafia worked differently. And the Russian mafia was, in effect, an arm of the KGB. It was allowed to operate so long as it served the interests of the KGB. So in 1984, we had this man named David Bogadin who went into Trump Tower. Trump was in his first burst of fame and glory and wealth, really. He had developed the Trump Tower in Midtown Manhattan. It was getting enormous amounts of publicity as this glitzy new skyscraper. And David Bogadin went in and said, well, I'll take 5 condominiums, 5 apartments. He put down $6 million. If you adjust it for inflation, that's nearly $20 million today. And as soon as that happened, when Russian mobsters bought apartments in Trump buildings, they were in effect laundering their money through Donald Trump's real estate. And over the years, I found a total of 13 people who were affiliated with the Russian mafia who owned properties in either Trump Tower or other Trump buildings. So in effect, this was almost headquarters for the Russian mafia in the United States. And the host was the man who later became president of the United States.
Yeah, can we assume that because Trump was a very party man, that they partied together, they socialized?
You know, that may well be the case. I don't know for certain, and I don't like to speculate if I can't prove something. But in the 90s, Trump was developing casinos in New Jersey, in Atlantic City, New Jersey. And we are certain that a lot of the Russian mobsters went to those casinos, and by buying large amounts of casino chips, that was another way for them to launder money as well. And Trump overexpanded enormously, and I think he had 3 or 4 huge casinos in Atlantic City. He oversaturated the market, and as a result, that led to a total of 6 bankruptcies. I mean, he was in many ways a terrible, terrible businessman, and it came to the Russian mafia to bail him out again and again and again.
So now let's get to the politics. And as you say, and Trump didn't enter into politics in 2016 when the world learned about him, because Trump was a guy maybe known in the United States in the real estate market, but he was not known to us outsiders. And he became president in 2016, but he ran in 1988, as you say, in presidential primaries against George W. Bush. So what proofs do you have, that KGB stood behind this idea of him running for presidency?
Well, it's interesting what started to happen in 1987 and 1988. One is Trump had met with Natalia Dubinina several times, and her father was ambassador at different times to both. He was a Soviet ambassador to the United Nations first, and later Soviet ambassador to the United States. And they met several times, and they sort of began to cultivate Trump and said, wow, we're so excited by Trump Tower. Wouldn't it be wonderful to have Trump Tower Moscow? And if you know anything about the Cold War, about the 1980s, that's sort of laughable on its face. The Soviet Union and the United States were in the heat of the Cold War. The Soviet Union was communist. They were railing against the excesses of American capitalism and conspicuous consumption. And the idea that they wanted to have a monument to American capitalism on Red Square is kind of ridiculous on its face.
That was my next question, but you're already answering.
Well, Yuri Shvets, again, who is one of my sources, had been a KGB agent in Washington Station recruiting spies for the Soviet Union. And when I asked him, what do you look for when you recruit a spy? He said, well, you want someone who's vain, who's narcissistic, who can be easily flattered. You want someone who can be seduced by beautiful women and knows no limits and can be reduced into excess. And that is Donald Trump to a T. So they began cultivating him that way. And it was actually the KGB that arranged Donald Trump's first trip to Moscow and what was then Leningrad as well. And it appears that Trump was groomed during that visit. We don't know for sure exactly what happened, but we do know what happened as soon as he got back, as soon as he returned to the United States later in 1987. And that's when people forget this, but he did make an abortive run for president in the 1980 presidential election. And to refresh people's memories, Ronald Reagan was president at the time. George H.W. Bush Sr., was vice president, and he was running for president in 1988. And it appeared that he had a lock on the nomination, and in fact he did. But Trump briefly seemed to challenge him, and he made one campaign appearance in New Hampshire, and he took out a full-page ad in the New York Times. And to me, that ad in the New York Times, and I reproduce it in my book, by the way, but that is what is most revealing, because it's a full-page ad in which he lashes out against the United States for participating in NATO, saying we're wasting money with it. And in effect, he is taking the same political stand he did with Zelensky just last week, but this is nearly 40 years earlier.
Exactly. So this is the same talking points or narrative that he's repeating since years. So he was fed with that. And as you say, because I know the name Dubinina from your book, but am I right to understand that they were the only ones officers of Trump, or you think there was maybe also somebody else somewhere else in different times?
It's quite possible there were other people meeting with Trump, and we do know he had he had a lot of sales of apartments to members of the Russian mafia. There was also later on people with links to the Russian mafia began and who were essentially Russian oligarchs with ties to Putin began developing Trump towers all over the world. And they were Donald Trump would get a share of the profits. He didn't have to put up any money to develop these buildings, but there was a Trump Tower in Toronto. There was one here in Soho in New York, the Trump Soho. They were abortive projects in Panama, Kazakhstan, all over the world. These were buildings that Trump did not necessarily develop, but his name was on them, and he got a very substantial share of the profits, even though he didn't put up any money.
Yeah, but you say that Russians already participated in this enterprise, building Trump towers, this system of franchising Trump towers in different parts of the world?
They were, if not Russians, members of the former Soviet Union.
Trump had this kind of imaginary relationship with Gorbachev that you were describing in your book. And the way he played, like if he knew him, was somehow similar to what he did with Putin later on before he became president. So what is this? What does it mean?
Right. Well, I think he exaggerated his relationship with Gorbachev enormously. And there was a report in the New York Times that Trump met with Gorbachev while he was in the Soviet Union in 1987. I don't believe that's true. I think the source on that most likely was Donald Trump himself giving an off-the-record background conversation to a reporter at the New York Times. But it has never been verified beyond that, so far as I know. And later that year, there was actually a Gorbachev impersonator who arrived at Trump Tower. It was widely publicized, and there are videos of it, I believe. And he went to Trump Tower, and Trump started to meet with them. And in the course of the meeting, it became clear that the man was actually a fake. Trump has always been trying to exaggerate how well connected he was with the former Soviet Union. Back in 1987, when he was doing that abortive run for the presidency, he gave interviews to the Washington Post, the New York Times, other publications, Playboy magazine, in which he claimed he should be the one to negotiate the strategic arms limitations talk with the Soviet Union. In fact, he had absolutely no expertise in that whatsoever, but he was putting himself forth as a major player on the world stage, when in fact he was sort of a real estate developer who was in the midst of multiple bankruptcies.
So one more question about Trump and his past, because you already touched on that a little bit, but Trump pretends to be a peacemaker today. Yeah, so he's talking a lot about peace and how he's very sorry about the deaths in Ukraine and how he wants to stop it. And again, this is not new, as you say, because in the 80s, he had this fixation on nuclear weapons and on stopping the nuclear war and Cold War by dismantling actually the Western alliance, which is what he's actually doing right now. And he was asking similar questions. I'm quoting after you. Why, this is after some article, why America should stop paying to defend countries that can afford to defend themselves. So this is what he's saying now about Europe, Japan. So how come that an American businessman got interested in world's politics?
Well, absolutely. And the thrust of everything he's done essentially is to destroy the Western alliance. And from my point of view, the Western alliance has been probably the most successful alliance in the history of foreign policy. If you go back 80 years, it's helped build strong democratic institutions throughout Europe and strong market economies and a military alliance. And it's all helped America, and I think it's helped Europe as well. So what the people who want to destroy it are in Russia. And there's no real reason to destroy the Western alliance unless your name is Vladimir Putin. It's extraordinary to me watching the Republican Party, which historically has been very strongly anti-communist, suddenly switching sides and getting on board with Vladimir Putin. And that is just breathtaking from an American point of view and probably from a European point of view as well, because Europe should not be our enemy.
Did you make this effort to count how many visits Trump made into Russia?
I don't know the exact number, and I do know they've not been fully reported. He went there a lot in the 1990s as well. The idea of having a Trump Tower near Red Square was floated again and again and again. Trump went over there certainly in the 90s. He went to casinos. I mean, it is well known how that the Russians try to trap Americans and other Westerners into compromised situations. And certainly there's been a lot of speculation, but that Trump has been trapped in Kompromat as well. And as far as I'm concerned, it's quite possible, but it's been very, very hard to pin down, and no one has actually seen any videotapes that I know of.
But also his family was frequently flying to Moscow, Ivanka, his sons. Is it a regular career of American business people?
Yes, no, it's very unusual. And it's also, you can see how Russian money was bailing out the Trumps in the 90s. They were funding all of Donald Trump's golf courses. Eric Trump, Donald Trump's second son, was famously said, "Oh, we don't need any money from Americans. We're getting it all from Russia." So there was no doubt that Russia was putting Trump in its pocket again and again and again.
So how do you frame it? Because I heard in many interviews you're talking about whether Trump was an asset, or is he an asset? Is he an agent? Is he an agent of influence, or just a contact for Russians?
Right. I think it's important to distinguish between an agent in the intelligence world and an asset. An agent who is someone who's employed by the CIA, the KGB, the FSB, or a major intelligence agency. He or she would know that he's an employee, they get paid, they are tasked with specific operations they have to perform. An asset is a much more informal relationship. It's someone who can be trusted, who's reliable, but it's a more informal relationship where we'll do a favor for you, you do a favor for us. And I think Trump is very much an asset. That's what Yuri Shvets was telling me, who was the former Russian KGB agent. And if you go back in history, the Soviet Union had cultivated a wealthy businessman. I'm thinking specifically of a man named Armand Hammer, who was a very wealthy oil industrialist in American, who got terrifically lucrative oil concessions from Joseph Stalin and with other Soviet leaders over the years. By the 1980s, he was an old man, and they were looking for people to replace him. And I suspect Donald Trump was initially cultivated on that basis. He's going to be an agent of influence, so to speak, an asset, not an agent, but an asset for first the Soviet Union and later the Russian Federation. And that's what he's become. And we could see it as early as 1987 when he took out that ad in the New York Times that I already mentioned. And he's done it again and again and again. All of his policies, he seems to be speaking to what the Soviet Union and now Russia really wants.
So, with all this knowledge that you have and some other journalists have, why is it that FBI was ignoring, the proofs that you were providing, and also special dossiers that were created about Trump? How can you explain that? For us, people outside, FBI is like the master agency. So how come, they failed so much? Like, when everybody almost knows, feels, senses that he is an asset, and FBI is not doing its job?
Yeah, I think the FBI was not doing its job, or at least it wasn't doing very well. And I think there were people in the FBI who were compromised, both by Donald Trump and by first the Soviet Union and later the Russian Federation. Trump made a point of being very close friends with the head of the FBI in New York City, and they would talk once a week or so. So Trump's building, this was a guy who was supposed to be providing oversight of Donald Trump's building. And yet, as I said earlier, I found 13 members of the Russian mafia who owned Trump property either in Trump Tower or other buildings. You also had two former heads of the FBI. One was a man named William Sessions, and the other was Louis Freeh. And William Sessions became the attorney for Simeon Mogilevich, who's one of the leading members of the Russian mafia. So just imagine for a moment, if you were an FBI agent and you see that your boss is now representing the head of the Russian mafia, what's that going to do to that's going to compromise your investigation somewhat. Similarly.
And when did it happen? Which year, do you remember? Was it in the 90s?
I would have to check on my dates. I believe it was late 80s, early 90s, sometime around then. William Sessions was later succeeded by Louis Freeh, who became head of the FBI in the Clinton administration. And he happens to live very near Mar-a-Lago in Palm Beach. Magnitsky was the lawyer for Prevezon, and suddenly Louis Freeh was representing the Russian interests on the other side of it. So all this would give FBI agents pause before they would really come after the FBI. And now it is much, much worse, because now that Trump is president again, he has installed Kash Patel as head of the FBI, and they're going after all the FBI agents who were seriously investigating the Russian mafia and so forth, and Trump's excesses and his ties to them. So the FBI has been compromised on this again and again. And now the United States at one time has had a terrific system of checks and balances, of oversight and accountability to make sure these kinds of abuses did not take place. But over the years, the Republicans have chipped away at them again and again and again. And the Russians are brilliant at that, and they're perfectly happy playing the long game. I have to admit, when Biden beat Trump, I didn't think Trump could ever come back into office. I was shocked that he won re-election, but the Russians seem to be content to do that. And if you look at the way they've tried to sabotage Ukraine, they tried to do it internally before they tried to do it militarily. And in truth, that can be much more successful. There's less bloodshed. There's more corruption, but less bloodshed when they do it that way. And they're doing it that way in the United States. They have not fired a shot, but they have a man in the White House.
So this is also something that can explain the failure of Mueller's report, right? The report was big, lots of details, but at the end of it, they didn't state that Trump is having any ties with Russia. I mean, it was not openly said.
There were several problems with the Mueller report. One is it was a criminal investigation as opposed to a counterintelligence investigation. And when we talk about things like Trump laundering money for the Russian mafia, I can prove that it takes place. I think my book gives evidence of that, and I'm quoting FBI files. There's no question that David Bogatin spent $6 million for these Trump properties. So we know that transaction took place. But to prosecute Trump criminally for that. You have to prove that he had knowledge that the money was coming from illicit sources. It's very hard to prove his state of mind. I mean, he didn't ask, gee, did you get all that money from sex trafficking? He's not that stupid. He just has to pretend he doesn't know that this money's coming from bad guys, and then it's impossible to prove. So the Mueller report was full of those kind of problems. It didn't pursue things in which you would see his real ties with the Russian mafia or with Russian intelligence. The other thing is, I think the Mueller report was wildly misrepresented. And in the end, it concluded that they couldn't prosecute Trump. But it didn't say, it also showed that he had extensive links with the Russians, and those are documented, but that requires reading it seriously, getting into the details of a 600 or 800 page report. And to be honest, most Americans are too lazy to do that, and most reporters are too lazy to do that as well. But there is a lot of documentation in that report that I think is probative and suggests that Trump has really been compromised by the Russians.
I would like to have it clear, because from what you say, I see many similarities with Poland, with what was happening here in the last 8 years, and how we are trying to fix it now, to get out from it, but also maybe committing same mistakes as you did. So I'm trying to learn from you to do it better. But so to have it clear, I mean, your opinion is that FBI, the intelligence was corrupted. That's it. That's how we can frame it. Yeah, and then second thing is that when they did investigations about him, the investigations went into a wrong kind of angle instead of going directly to the point. Because I imagine that it could be done, that shifting from the criminal issues that are there, like the financial relationships of Trump, if that would be done by a special committee, let's say, on security service, not within the intelligence, but from outside, somebody who would scrutinize them, then that would work out, right?
Right. Well, in fact, there was a Senate Intelligence Committee investigation into this, which was revealed more compromises by Trump, but it has basically, when Trump was president, all of that was hushed up, wasn't widely reported. And it was sort of shocking to me how lazy some reporters were. I think there's been a big failure of the American press as well.
So you're also blaming the press?
Absolutely, absolutely. And what you see here is there's a term of art called access journalism. I don't know if you know that in Poland, but it's essentially, if you want to get a big story every week, you want to be friends with Donald Trump, and he'll give you headlines. If you get an exclusive interview with him every week, you're going to get headlines, but you're not going to get that interview if you're critical of him. So you're in his pocket, and that happens all the time in the United States, probably in other countries as well. And I think too many American publications, including even the New York Times, are susceptible to that. And they give in, they want access, so they don't want to piss off whoever they're writing about, and they pull their punches. And that happens again and again and again and again. And it's happening right now, again, with Trump, now that he's in power, yet again. You can see the major organs of the press who are bending their knee to Donald Trump.
Yeah, and how do you imagine the intelligence? They are probably cleaning up the files, right?
It's worse. It's completely taken over. I already said what's happened to the FBI. The same thing is happening to the CIA. And in charge of overseeing all of our intelligence services, you have Tulsi Gabbard, who might as well be working for Vladimir Putin. Well, I think Europe would be crazy to keep sharing its intelligence with the United States. To me, this marks the end of NATO. It's the end of the Western Alliance. This is a great historic turning point in history. The Western Alliance has been successful for 80 years. But what is NATO if the United States is not a reliable partner?
So the last question for you is here, but if you have something to add, feel free. How do you feel as a person who knew who Trump is, who warned about him, and was not listened to? It must be frustrating.
It's enormously frustrating, and I can go back more than 40 years. I in the 1980s, I was a reporter at New York Magazine, and back then Trump was still in his 30s, but he was this sort of flashy rich guy. You know, frankly, I thought he was a joke. He was a clown. He was sort of vulgar and Las Vegas aesthetics, you know, sort of flashy, big money. And reporters would cozy up to him because they thought he made good stories. And at that time, I just found it a bit distasteful. But for him to become the most powerful man in the world, which he may, I guess he is now, right, is breathtaking. And to see people still falling for that, I can't tell if people genuinely believe it or they're just pursuing what is in their best interest. They think they can make a quick buck by having a best-selling book or whatever that in which they put forth Donald Trump's views, front page stories in the newspaper. So it's very distressing now that he's bringing in Elon Musk, the richest man in the world, as his sidekick. It's just horrifying. And you can see also the whole idea of free press disappearing right now. What was Twitter and is now X is probably the most powerful media platform in the United States, if not the world. And Trump's pal, Elon Musk, controls it. And you can tell the way he is manipulating the flow of information so that it to the advantage of Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin.
So you've been working on Trump since the early 80s?
I've done other things. You know what? I have done 6 books. My last 6 books have been on the Republican Party's assault on democracy. And to me, this started before Donald Trump. It started as early as 1968. And we've had the Republican Party, which has been taking great liberties with democracy. They've been doing anti-democratic measures since at least 1968, in which they have hijacked American foreign policy as private citizens when they're not elected. This goes back to the Vietnam War. Lyndon Johnson was trying to end the Vietnam War in 1968 Paris peace talks. And in my new book, Den of Spies, here I show how the Republican parties undermined that and sabotaged the Paris peace talks in 1968, and that helped lead to Nixon's victory back then. And they've done that kind of thing again and again and again. I've done 2 books on Donald Trump. I hope to hell I don't have to do a third one. But he is not through yet, and it's very, very distressing. But to me, it is a long march in which we see American democracy being destroyed. And that is what is happening. We see those checks and balances are being chipped away by the Republican Party again and again and again and again. I would like to see an end to it.
Thank you for all you said and for your time and for your patience.